started, I'd love to hear from the two of you about this idea of white supremacy and creating false dichotomies that are pitting us against each other. How are you all seeing this play out in like current events?
I can get us started on
Please.
a couple that show up for me.
Please.
I'll name without, relitigating it and giving more air where it is not due, that the conversation around Kanye West's anti-Semitism is where a lot of this started percolating for me personally, in feeling like I started to sit with this idea that, of course, especially as a Jewish woman, I would like people with public personas to be held to account when they are being anti-Semitic and like threatening actual violence, and also being used as a catalyst for other people who will act on that violence as sort of part of that conversation. I want there to be accountability. I want there to be consequences. And I was getting really stuck on the swift reaction, public reaction, the swift consequences, both tangible and intangible, for some of that rhetoric, when Kanye has spent a long time over the course of the past few years being very anti-Black, being very harmful to other marginalized groups, saying things that are out of line and not facing the same kinds of consequences for any of that commentary. And for me, coming back to sort of my intro point here, it truly made me more fearful as a Jewish person that we are continuing to perpetuate some of those stereotypes about who controls the narrative, who controls the media, the swift reaction because it was anti-Semitism. And now that's the line that we're choosing, and that's where there's consequences. It did truly start to make me feel more concerned that it was reinforcing that particularly harmful narrative, while also trying to sit with the fact that, like, he is causing harm. He is doing something that is saying something about that I am tied to personally that I find harmful. So trying to hold both of those things, right? That I want there to be accountability, and I am concerned that there hasn't been accountability for other folks who have been harmed by the same person in just as extreme ways. And sort of reinforcing that, what I've been calling like that Ouroboros of the narrative, that, there's control there's different power dynamics at play that are working under the surface or secret. So that's the first place that it started to come up for me in the recent sort of conversation that's happening. Nora, how about you?
I mean, similarly, I think I had people really tapping me like, Nora, what do you think about this? Because I'm Palestinian, honestly. So they'll say, Nora, is this like, what do you think about this? As if I'm some kind of expert on it, which, we always say don't tokenize people, but that's just, it's part of my job. And I think the conversation about around this, I think, is very similar to what you shared, Becca, of like, I think this is incredibly harmful, and this is incredibly, anti-Semitic. I think when we get into the conversation of Palestine and Israel, people complicate it to a point of like, well, if it's anti-Israel, then it's anti-Semitic. And I think those are places that really hit very close to home for me, right? And so that complicates that piece of the conversation. I have other things that have been coming up for me specifically around false dichotomies, but I'd love to invite your voice into this piece of it, Keela, before I move into some other parts as well.
No, let's transition to the false dichotomies piece. I would love to. I feel like everything that bothers me or upset me has already been said with the context setting slide about everything about Kanye and everything else. So please get into it.
Appreciate that, Keila. I think like, along with like wanting to just separate like Jewish and Muslim people, Jewish and Arab people when it comes to anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of that kind of goes along with what's showing up for me around the World Cup and all the coverage around the World Cup. Like, you're either with us or you're against us. It's really just such a binary dichotomy. And so the World Cup having just ended and seeing all the, up to the World Cup beginning and all the coverage around Qatar and the ways that Qatar has, I say Qatar and I'm like, I know how to say it correctly. And anyone who's watching is like, Nor, say it right. Just like the ways in which this Muslim nation has their own culture, has their own religious practices, and is it right or is it wrong? And I think like, again, that you're either with us or you're against us kind of culture, along with like, just seeing the practice of tokenizing and practice of like, who's right and who's wrong. I guess I'm getting, I think, at a loss for words, but I think like you see the Palestinian flag being flown all over, the Muslim identity being like expressed in so many different ways, and especially where it comes into play around like, especially around not drinking or anti-support for LGBTQ rights. I think people get very kind of just like separating that out, or like the way migrant workers have been treated in Qatar. And I think like what it came down to for me is, okay, you have to choose a side. And I think, no, I don't have to choose a side. At the end of the day, I don't agree with this and I do agree with that. Like, I don't think that, we have to choose those sides. And I think being able to be in this conversation with you all, with the nuance and the anxiety and the feelings that I have as I share, I think is part of the work, is part of the our consciousness raising. And I refuse to be pinned in a corner.
I feel that. I think as an idealist, I really, something as I get further in my understanding of like justice and equity, it's like, I really want something to be all the way bad or all the way good. And then we get these complex situations where it's just not that. It's great in theory that the World Cup travels, right? And then it's great in theory to be able to do the rainbow armband. But then I also feel like there's an edge to the way that journalists, at least from American perspective, describe the events that are taking place in Qatar. Like, that they wouldn't do that in the United States, where LGBTQ rights are very much still up for debate. There's very much a way that, in my mind, I've put Kanye West out to pasture, in which this new incident about the anti-Semitism has just come up as this new concept. It's just, the white supremacy is white supremacy. It's insidious, and it embeds itself in these incredibly deep ways. And it's complex. It's complex to pull apart. It's hard to say something is fully no. There are very few things that are incredibly clear. And we've had this conversation as a team for participants about folks who love the World Cup. Life is troubling. If you like the World Cup, you like the World Cup. And there's some pretty criminal things that are happening. There are things I like that are wonderful to me, but are also terrible. And so it's naming that. But sometimes I feel like there is a deep fear and a shame of people want to be so pure in their equity that they just can't let that go, can't admit that something they care about or something they enjoy has valid critique associated to it.
100%. And I think like we haven't seen a good, a way that the World Cup has been just. I mean, and
yeah,
like what for me as a Muslim person watching this happen in Qatar has been, the double standard of how Qatar is being held accountable in ways that others, not to say that that's excusable, but that like this
Absolutely.
hasn't been the same conversation when the World Cup has been held in other parts of the world. And
Absolutely.
I think just how we're holding that accountability across the board and that critical lens everywhere, especially when it comes to, like the rainbow armband, I saw a lot of people putting up kind of Germany's like covering their mouths and then putting critiques of the way Germany does that, or the ways in which, the US also here in the United States, we're not really doing much good for these communities either. And so how are we really being conscious of what justice looks like, and how are we also not minimizing the stakes in which Qatar has allowed this to happen?
Absolutely.
I see it as something too that these different conversations in so many ways feel like they're forcing us to be more insular and more sort of staying on sides, that there is not a lot of room for exploring outside of the identities you hold under trying to sort of coalition build across those lines feels harder and harder when you are being forced. I think, Nora, as you were saying, like, choose us versus them. You must choose. There is no room for conversation. And I think, Keela, coming back to your comment about it having to be so pure, right? That there is, folks really want clarity. And I understand that desire, right? You want to know if something is right or wrong. You want to know it. And we see that, I think, in our work in all different ways and all different times. What's the right word to use? What is the right thing to say? Can I say this anymore? Can I not? All of those sort of binary choices that folks are looking for. I know that can make it feel comfortable and easy and safe, and that searching for that common language can be a valuable tool. And if we rest on that, I think we end up just consistently creating new corners for ourselves and for the people around us. And that, I know for me, that's been a personally challenging journey of like, I like to know sort of the what. I like to know how to be able to do something in a way that is both careful and kind, but also correct. For myself personally, I like to make sure I'm doing things the right way. And unpacking that, this idea of right way is already not real, right? It's already not real. And if it is real, it's to someone's benefit, and probably not my own. And that feels pretty hard to just kind of accept as the reality.
I really struggle with this like concept of right way. Like sometimes things are just, it's bad because it's bad. Like I understand it. And not to, for soccer people who are on this call, I'm not a soccer girl. So please, it's fair critique of me, but learning so much about the World Cup of like the way that people were treated working to build the stadium, the way that Western media coverage exacerbated and exoticized Muslim players just wanting to pray and requesting game times around prayer times is bad. Like that's not good. And I guess there's also positionality matters, right? Like I do not identify as Jewish and I do not identify as Muslim. And so the way I feel about speaking up about something is different. My buy-in or my inherent based on identity, privilege, and positioning looks different. And we'll get to this nuance about allyship and how we stand together later on. But I think something that's frustrating for me is that sometimes there is a hesitancy of people want to be right and do it the nicest way. And I'm like, that's just bad. Like that's a bad thing that happened, or that's a bad thing that someone said.
I think what comes up for me, Keela, as you're sharing is like, and Becca, I think with that right way is, I mean, at what point are we getting messy, right? And making mistakes? And how are we holding ourselves accountable around those mistakes? Because like, I also don't want this conversation to be about like, oh, I don't want to have to choose a side. So I'm just going to stand still. And if anybody's been in any session with me ever knows that I love the Beverly Tatum quote on the moving walkway, and standing still just perpetuates racism, continues to perpetuate white supremacy. And so we don't want to do that at all. But how are we turning around and being able to like really be conscious of the ways in which like we're challenging this dominant narrative around what's the one right way, and how are we inviting multiple ways of showing up and being. And I think like whether it's the World Cup or we're talking about, you know, something I think even more polarizing, like the example you gave around Kanye West, Becca, I think like people can often get in their feels about like, this is blatantly like harmful and can't be done. And there's a double standard and a, you know, duality here. And how are you holding that both and?